Welcome to Amici, news and insights from the New York courts. I'm John Carr. We live in a nation of immigrants, and our Diversity Dialogue segment is designed to highlight people in the court system who bring unique experiences and different perspectives to everything we do, behind the scenes and in the courtroom. That diversity, as we've heard over the years from the more than 70 people who have appeared on this program, is not simply a matter of ethnic pride. The inclusion of people from every background provides our court system with a richness and insight that is unparalleled. I've learned a tremendous amount from people of different traditions, and I hope you have as well. Today we're going to learn about a people we have not discussed before, a people that endured genocide, ethnic cleansing, segregation, and religious persecution. They were dismissed as overbred subhuman barbarians, and in the census were not considered black or white, but other. I'm referring to the Irish. And our guest today is Shane O'Donoghue, a management analyst with the Division for E-Filing and a child of Irish immigrants. I'll ask Shane, a member of the Emerald Society within the courts, to go over some Irish history with us and explain, among other things, why the Irish refer to the incident that brought many of them here not as a famine, but a hunger. And we'll discuss the Irish experience in America. Shane, thank you for coming on the program. Let's start with your parents, if we could. So your parents came over to the United States during an era known as, quote, the Troubles, long after the Cromwell Reign of Terror and the potato famine, a word I use in quotes. Can you briefly describe what that era was, when it was, and whether it was the Troubles that your parents came here to escape?
Sure. First, thank you for having me on the program. I very much appreciate it. The Troubles were a nationalistic and a sectarian war between the Protestants that were loyalists to England and the Catholics who were generally original Irish that were there. The Troubles happened from 1968 to the second ceasefire agreement in 1998, which was also known as the Good Friday Agreement. It really started as a civil rights movement that was heavily influenced by the civil rights movement that the United States was experiencing. They seen the things that were happening here in the U.S., like the Freedom Riders, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, all those things were happening simultaneously, and they were trying to mimic it. It was the Catholics that were living in the North were trying to end the discrimination and obtain equal rights and the better treatments, really, of quality of life. They wanted better jobs, better neighborhoods, better communities, things like that. The problem, though, they were running into a lot of the times where the Protestants were pretty much on every level of government, including the police. And that would lead to kind of a bit of uprisings, a bit of like skirmishes with the police and the citizens. The English would eventually send soldiers in to quash this uprising to try to restore order. This was not received well by the Catholics. This led to the creation of the new version of the IRA, which is the Irish Republican Army, which they called themselves the Provos or the Provisional Irish Republican Army. This was a conflict that led into really, I think it was like 52% of the casualty rate in that conflict was civilians. So it was really kind of very unfortunate that the mass part of the casualties on that were civilians. Depending on what you see now, I know like currently there's a lot of new information that's been released. I think the Boston College released a series of transcripts and video footage of people being interviewed that were participants in that war. I know that they kind of waited a long time to do it because they wanted a lot of people to have passed away. Because if you were in the IRA, it was a death sentence to talk about the IRA. But I also I know currently that there's information out there now that paints Jerry Adams in a bit of a different light. Jerry Adams is currently the head of the Sinn Féin political party, which is the political wing of the IRA. And I know that there's an individual, Brendan Hughes, who was more so, he was the head of I believe it was D Company in the IRA that was kind of on the front line. He paints a picture that Jerry Adams allowed Bobby Sands, who was during a starvation protest, a hunger protest in Long Kesh, which was a prison, to die. And apparently he allowed him to die to allow to essentially to martyr him so that he can get Sinn Féin off the ground. So some people think he's a traitor, some people don't. It's hard to say. It's hard to Monday morning general a guerrilla war when I'm not the one pulling the trigger on my neighbors. But my parents, though, they did not try to escape the troubles. They were already in the South. My father was trying to escape extreme poverty. And my mother, essentially, she was brought over with my grandmother, who was trying to escape kind of the Catholic Church.
Let's go back to your father and the poverty.
Sure.
What were the roots of that?
So my father was from Northwest Kerry, in a very small, not even a town, but he's from a farm. So they were farmers. They were there during all of the Great Hunger, the whole nine. They really didn't have much work. I mean, you can only do so much. He wound up leaving Ireland at 12 to go to England with him and two of his friends, who I think were like 13 and 14, to help build the tunnels that became the English subway system.
Okay, so your father is a young teenager working in England. How does he get from there to here, and when, and why?
So when he was in England, he eventually did time there and kind of slowed up, and then he went back to Ireland to see if there was any work there, and there was no work there either. So he eventually came to New York City, and I mean, he really left in search of work. There was really no work in England or Ireland at the time, and he gets to America, and he kind of meets two of his friends that he knew from Ireland, and they get an apartment together, and they start working in the union. And from there, he spent a solid amount of time. I think it was like 25 years before he went back to Ireland. During that time, he met my mother, and they both met in a bar, which is, I feel, a stereotypical Irish thing, but neither of them drink, which is ironic. And then from there, they eventually got married, had me, and did the American dream kind of thing.
And then how did your mother get here?
My mother came here with my grandmother when she immigrated. She initially left Ireland because of poverty. She went to England, and then from England went back to Ireland, and back to Ireland to America in search of work.
Well, a very similar route that your father took, really.
Yeah, or they left there to come here in search of work. There was really no work to be found in America either for them. They kind of struggled. They struggled to find, like, people didn't want to rent to them. People didn't want to hire them. Eventually, my grandmother found a job. Her husband my grandfather found a job, and they became a super of a building. And they also had to find other work as well to kind of make ends meet. But once the work dried up, my mother was sent back with her siblings to Ireland to live with their aunt. And they spent years back there. They did a lot of their schooling back there. And then they came back to America, I would say, in probably the mid 70s, probably to early 80s, came back. And then my mother stayed here for the duration. She's still here. They were able to, become successful in America, where Ireland gave them no opportunities.
Parents talk much about life in the old country?
My parents did. My grandparent, when my grandmother immigrated here as well, on my mother's side, she also spoke about it frequently. I did get a lot of the very frequent or very common thing where I had to walk 15 miles to school uphill in the snow kind of thing. Turns out for my father, it was kind of true, except it was just in the rain. It was like 7 miles in the rain each way. He went to a school that was essentially just a hut in the middle of a field called Nuckalucka. And when he was there, they didn't, where my grandfather lived on my father's side, their house was the quintessential cottage. The only difference was they didn't get a concrete floor until I think 1992. It was the same year they got indoor plumbing. They had dirt floors back then. My father would often talk about how it used to be so cold that they used to have to bring the farm animals into the house to kind of maintain the warmth. Houses back then were generally just dirt floors, 2-3 rooms max. You'd have an open fire that was just roaring up the wall. I've seen that firsthand myself in older people's houses there. But it's an absolute brutal way to live if you have the essentially luck of being born in like a first world country. When I went back there and I seen it firsthand, I was like, there is no way that you can maintain a life like this, and they do without question, which is very impressive to me.
Now, poverty was pervasive in the south of Ireland, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Poverty was a very big problem back then. The country itself kind of went broke fighting the war for independence, so they couldn't really afford any social services or anything like that, or anything to help the country. It was a very common story that people would leave even up until the 80s and 90s because there was no work. There was really, you were a farmer, especially in the South, you were kind of a farmer, or you were kind of like a small business owner. You ran a small bed and breakfast towards the 90s and the 2000s, but back then it was definitely a huge problem.
So even though your parents didn't directly leave because of the Troubles, they were living in an area that it was in the midst of a 30-year war that certainly left them impoverished and, or maybe if he didn't go to the north, not unsafe, but not the safest.
Absolutely. I mean, even in the South, it was relatively, if you were close to the north, it could be at times unsafe because the provos were back and forth from the north and the south doing trainings and things like that. Like a lot of their explosive trainings were done on farms in the South.
Hey, you mentioned Pedro Campos, and I'm kind of intrigued that Ireland was influenced by Hispanic and Black civil rights activists from other countries.
Absolutely.
And I'm also referring, of course, to Frederick Douglass, who went to Ireland, my gosh, 1850s or something around there.
Sounds.
And found a lot in common.
Yes. So, I mean, Pedro Campos was a Puerto Rican political figure during their independence movement from Spain. At the time, Puerto Rico was a colony of Spain. Ireland at that time essentially was a colony of England. So they had that similarity. And I mean, the United States eventually has kind of developed its own issue with what could be perceived to be colonies. But the Irish needed help writing this. So they had Eamon de Valera, who was kind of the head of their movement for independence, who was, I believe, an attorney, but he was also needing help on how to word this correctly. And Pedro Campos, who was also an attorney, came over and was able to kind of set the groundwork for writing that independence declaration. And the way that the way that they found each other was when the Irish went through the indentured servitude process. They found themselves in countries like Barbados. They found themselves all over the Caribbean. Puerto Rico was one of them. The Irish had a very large Puerto Rican population, or I should say Puerto Rico had a very large Irish population after they were turned away from American ports and things like that, and they helped with the sugar imports.
Oh, well, now, I mentioned it a moment ago, the Cromwell Reign of Terror. Can you give us a brief synopsis of what that was all about?
I can. So the Cromwell Reign of Terror was a kind of an interesting story because Ireland was kind of in the midst of a civil war at the time. Cromwell was really, they call it the 11-Year War. Cromwell was really there only from about 1649-ish to maybe 1653. The lasting effects, though, were felt up until the 1900s. I mean, Ireland was in a civil war. At the time, King Charles, I believe the first, was involved in kind of a bit of a scandal in England. I know he killed an archbishop, and the aristocracy wasn't too pleased with him for it. The Protestant Pope had also told him that he should probably think about taking over Ireland. They call it the Reconquest of Ireland. So Oliver Cromwell had just shut down a massive rebellion in Scotland. So the King of England said, I got just the guy to send to Ireland. So he sends him over, and the first thing Oliver Cromwell does is he goes to the eastern part of Ireland, which is very close. You can kind of see it from England, the eastern part of Ireland. And the first thing he does is he goes to two kind of areas. I think one was in County Wexford. The other one, I think, was Dogdra, and just absolutely slaughters everybody. Just an absolute massacre, man, woman, child, soldier, anyone who was a Roman Catholic. And he kind of says, this is how it's going to go until you guys assimilate to our culture. So the Irish kind of try to fight back, but England has probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, navies in the world, so that it's hard to fight back when you're getting bombarded from sea.
So was that difficulty between the Irish and the English? Was it primarily a matter of religious persecution or ethnic hatred, or both?
I'd say it's a good combination of both. So the English hated that the Irish would view themselves as Irish, that they didn't want to be a part of the English rule. They also hated the fact that they were not Protestants. The English were Protestants. The Irish were primarily Roman Catholic. When they came over, like, the Irish did have their own earlier paganistic religions that were still very minor. Like, they had a very small representation there. But if you were a Catholic, the Protestants did not like you. They sent over all these people to kind of occupy Ireland, to try to dismantle their culture, to dismantle their way of life. Really, like, their values, their day-to-day life was ruined. So what they wound up doing was they wound up taking the land that the Irish had. They took it from them, and they would give it to the aristocracy to become landlords, things like that. In the time that they were the landlords, I mean, the Irish were essentially paying rent to live on their own lands. And it wasn't necessarily money. England didn't really have a lot of options when it came to growing their own foods, things like that. So they would outsource that to separate colonies. So like India, Ireland, things like that.
Now, not only did the Irish get displaced from their land, they got their property, they got displaced from their country. I know a lot of them were transported to Barbados as, at best, indentured servants. What can you share about that era?
It was tough. So the difference between, I guess, would be indentured servitude and what you would commonly think of as slavery at the time is widely disputed. A lot of people say, though, it wasn't that similar. The way it would go is you would be sent, if you were a political opponent or if you were a POW, Cromwell would take you, put you on a boat. They would send you to essentially a penal camp where you would work off 7 years, and you would eventually get your freedom papers, your freedom rights to go about the rest of your life. What also happened, though, is people who were in such dire straits would agree to go work on a plantation, a lot of the time sugar plantations or tobacco plantations, and they would agree to work 7 years in exchange for their freedom papers to continue with the rest of their lives. What you do see, though, is they didn't really end at 7 years. So they were able to extend that time. The landlord or the plantation owners, or I think they called them the grower class back then, they were able to extend those periods for any minor infraction. Initially, I believe that they included, because they did also have your slaves from African descents as well, and the native populations. But initially, they housed the Irish with the slaves, and it led to some rebellions, which they had trouble dealing with, and then they separated them. From there, after they eventually did get their papers, they would leave, or they would stay, or they would leave to like other Caribbean countries. It was not good for them, though. The quality of life was poor. A lot of the times it was brutal. The living conditions were very poor. Uh, there are some reports that the Irish were able to receive meat for food where the regular slaves were not. But either way, I mean, if you're working, getting beat, living in poor conditions, and you're not being paid, it's essentially a variation of slavery.
Let's fast forward to the Great Hunger, as the Irish call it, the period in the mid-1800s when 1 million people died of starvation and related diseases, and more than 2 million emigrated, many of them over to the United States, of course. First, why do the Irish refer to it as the Great Hunger rather than potato famine?
There was no famine. There was no shortage of food. There was no shortage of crops. There was no shortage of meat. The only issue was the Irish were charged that to live on their land. So that was essentially the rent that was due every month to the landlords that were maintaining control of Ireland. And I mean, they would have to turn this over. The only crop that they were able to really grow and keep for themselves were potatoes. And funny enough, potatoes are one of the only foods that you can maintain an existence on without. It has enough minerals, carbs to maintain life. So from there, what wound up happening was there was a rot. So there was a infectious rot that spread between the potatoes, and I think it was 75% of their crops got decimated over the course of a couple of years. That led to a mass starvation. The world at this point which is kind of strange because there wasn't really, you couldn't go on the internet and see what was happening across the world, but the world was taking notice of this. So like the Sultan of Turkey at the time was trying to donate, I believe it was 10,000 pounds to the Irish to help them kind of buy food, supplies to keep them going. But the Queen of England was only really donating 2, so nobody could outdo her. So she wouldn't allow this to happen. So the Sultan said, fine, I'll donate 1,000 pounds. But then in secrecy, in the dead of night, one night, he sends 5 boatloads of food to kind of help them. Then you look at the other side, which is America. The Choctaw natives actually donated $170 to try to help feed them, which is kind of interesting because the Native Americans at that time were going through their own problems. And they kind of pooled together to try to help the Irish. The Irish did try to repay them to an extent. They gave them $1.8 million in aid during COVID, but they maintain to this day a kind of a close relationship.
That's fascinating. One of the legends told in my Irish family is that of the so-called Soupers, Soupers. Tell us what the Soupers were.
So the Soupers were essentially people who converted for bowls of soup. They would agree to leave Roman Catholicism behind to go to Protestantism. It was really set up by Protestant societies they developed schools where starving children or people were able to be fed in return for converting to Protestantism. It kind of ruined the reputation of other Protestant groups who were trying to give legitimate aid without conversion. The Irish refused essentially to go to any soup kitchens or anything like that, where they would choose their religion and their faith over being fed. At the time, though, if you were a super, you did take aid from the Protestants and you did go to these Protestant schools, you were immediately outcast. You were a traitor. If you're willing to take food from the Protestants, you're willing to give information and how to essentially rat out your neighbors to the English. To this day, I know some families maintain essentially a grudge towards these other families. I have heard through my time there that these people were supers and these people would rat us out. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of years later, and they maintain those grudges.
The Irish do tend to maintain grudges.
That is absolutely true.
So from the 1800s to 20s, really. There's this enormous dispersion of Irish, with a great many ending up on American shores. What sort of degradation and discrimination did they experience here?
Um, it was tough for them when they would land here. Nobody wanted them to be here. Well, until they realized how powerful of a voting base they could be. But they faced starvation. There was no work. At the time, America was majority Protestant. So to come over here as a Catholic, you were an outcast either way. The Civil War was going on during that time as well. You would find yourselves a lot of violence. They were forced into gangs to kind of maintain safety in numbers almost. You'd see a lot of people turning to prostitution, theft, things like that, just to survive on a day-to-day basis. The American Army, or the North, I should say, had a unique way to acquire soldiers, where they would meet you at the docks and they would say, "You look very hungry. If you sign these papers, we'll give you some food." And the minute you sign this, they'd say, "Here's your uniform. You're off to go fight in the Civil War now. Thank you so much for your service." And they would find themselves on the front lines a lot of the times because they were so expendable. Like, they were coming in more rapidly than they could clothe into the uniforms. So it was very tough for them to find a place in the United States where they can kind of carve out a community for themselves.
Now, during the same period, we saw the rise of the so-called Know Nothing Party, a political movement that evolved out of fear that the country was being taken over by immigrants, mainly Irish and German, who were, quote, poisoning the blood of the country, undermining the foundation of the nation, and taking jobs and resources away from native-born Americans. In fact, I believe there was a conspiracy theory that the Pope and his army were going to land in the U.S., overthrow the government, impose a Catholic canon as the law of the land, and move the Vatican to Cincinnati. I don't know why Cincinnati. I think it should have gone to Buffalo. But from your research, what was that era like, the Know Nothing era like for the Irish?
I mean, when you really look at it, it's just pure xenophobia. The Irish suffered a great deal under this. The Know Nothing Party also called themselves the Native American Party, which is ironic because not a single one of them are Native Americans. It was designed, though, to keep foreign influence from becoming the norm and the assimilation of the Irish community and the German community. They really kind of blamed the Irish for everything. They blamed the Irish for the Democrats realizing what kind of voter base they had the capability of having. They also split after a couple of years. They really only lasted a few years. They split because they argued over slavery. But they did not like the Irish. They did not like any variation of an outside culture or an outside custom coming in and uprooting what their Protestant norm was.
But they did, kind of elect a president. Millard Fillmore, I don't know if he was a member of the Know Nothing Party, but he was elected on the strength of that nativist campaign and pandering to fears of Irish refugees, right?
Absolutely. I mean, he kind of kept quiet about his affiliations with the Know Nothing Party. He was a part, I believe, the Know Nothing Party had a quote unquote secret society. I believe it was called the Star Spangled Banner Group or something along those lines. He was supposedly a member of this. It was essentially fear mongering. So like, he ran on fear mongering, saying these people are going to take your jobs. They're going to take everything that you have, and you're going to be forced to come to become a Catholic. The Pope's going to come, things like that. The Pope has an army waiting to infiltrate the United States. It was very much fear mongering, and the American public went for it. They voted him in. He became the president. I believe he lost to a Democrat right after, which had a large Irish voting base. But it was a tough time for the Irish.
I remember hearing my father and particularly my grandfather talk about the "No Irish Need Apply" signs and classified newspaper ads and signs at restaurants warning that Irishmen and dogs would not be served. And that was probably 80 years after the Know Nothings and Millard Fillmore. Would you say it was the election of John F. Kennedy, the first Irish Catholic ever elected president, in 1960 that with that the Irish finally arrived in American mainstream society?
Absolutely. I think so. I think that the election of JFK kind of solidified the status of the Irish American. So like they kind of said, you've assimilated enough into the American culture that you are now deemed to be a regular. They kind of still had they faced they still faced a bit of socioeconomic issues where they were kind of stuck as blue collar. It was really just the Kennedys that kind of held a strong foothold in positions of power there. But the Irish definitely at that point were kind of accepted as Americans at that point. I know that the Pope was kind of, the rumor was the Pope was a little nervous when they elected him because in every Irish household in Ireland, there's a picture of the Sacred Heart. And then there was a picture of JFK in there as well, but they were replacing the picture of the Pope with JFK at the time. So I think the Pope was a little nervous.
Did you grow up with a lot of Irish pride in your household?
I guess we did. I don't know if it was like pride. You were very acutely aware that you were Irish. Like you were aware that what happened. You were aware of what the history was. To an extent, you were kind of alienated to a group that was just like a lot of the people growing up that I was around were Irish. So like all my parents, all their friends, they were off the boat Irish as well. Their children were first generation, same as me. I guess we did have a bit of pride because it was like we went through all these troubles and we went through all these problems and we've assimilated. Our children are American. Like we've landed in America. We've made a community for ourselves.
Are there any particular traditions that your parents brought with them from Ireland that you've continued?
I'd say a bit of tradition. If I'd say dysfunctionality would be a tradition. A bit of like I know dark humor and sarcasm is almost an Irish tradition. GAA All Ireland Sunday, which this year is July 27th for the football and the hurling. Every Sunday right now there's the league, so we pay attention to that very, very in depth. But my mother is from Dublin and my father is from Kerry, so that is the biggest rivalry. So they pay attention to that.
What do you mean by dysfunctionality?
The Irish are notoriously dysfunctional. I mean, I guess even the way things go, like Sigmund Freud said, you can't psychoanalyze the Irish. The Irish in dysfunctionality, like they do everything kind of their own way. They're stubborn to the point where they're going to learn it either the hard way or the hard way. Like there is no easy acceptance for them. So they learn everything through don't touch the stove. You touch the stove, you burn yourself. And that's how you learn.
Somebody said, maybe it was Mark Twain, it kind of sounds like him, that the Irish are civilized but not domesticated.
Absolutely. That is absolutely true.
We're about to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, and we know how it's celebrated here with parades and green beer and whatever. What will be going on in Ireland on March 17th?
In the major cities, there will be parades, there'll be celebrations, things like that. I know they light up a lot of the major buildings, churches, things like that in green lighting. But I think those are more so for the tourist attractions. Your average run-of-the-mill Irish, they hit a mass, they go to church, and that's about it. They go back home.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, you told me offline that there's another holiday, an American holiday, that's actually a bigger deal over there. Will you share that story with our listeners?
Sure. So I was in Ireland for the 4th of July. I was working over there, and I was talking to some of the people, and I was in Limerick, and I was also in Dublin. And Limerick had huge Lady Liberties. They had American flags everywhere.
Dublin had a very similar vibe. A lot of American flags going around, a lot of 4th of July things. And I was talking to some of the older people, and I'm like, why do you guys care so much about the 4th of July? And they're like, because you guys beat the English. So they appreciate the fact that we were able to beat the English as well. I mean, they fought their own battles to kind of maintain what they have against the English. And now I'd say there is a touch of tourist attractions in those larger cities, but a lot of the older generations do appreciate the fact that the United States was able to remove the English from their land as the Irish attempted to and somewhat succeeded.
That's fascinating. Back to the court system. I believe you're a member of the New York State Courts Emerald Society. What is it?
New York State Emerald Society is it's kind of an Irish society. You don't have to be Irish to join. It's people who have similar. I mean, if it's a group of people who have the same cultural or ethnic background. It's also more than that. It's more so a community. If you're looking for people to celebrate your wins with you and kind of help you pick yourself up from your losses, even to some of the best advice that I've ever received in my personal life and my professional life has been from members of the Emerald Society. Like I said, though, you don't have to be Irish. If you're looking to come learn more about the Irish population, Irish customs, culture, things like that, you're more than welcome. Definitely reach out to our leadership. I know that they have Facebook, Twitter, or X, whatever they're calling it these days. They have social media accounts. They're very accessible by social media, but everybody is welcome.
Why is diversity important in a court system?
It's incredibly important. It creates really an atmosphere of empathy. Once you see that diversity and you can see what other people's socio and economical challenges were, what their cultural problems that they faced were, what their stories are, you kind of have a sense of empathy for them, and you want to give them a helping hand. You understand why things are the way they are and how things can get better.
And as we approach St. Patrick's Day, what would you like people to remember most about the experience and contributions of Irish Americans?
Look outside. You go outside, look up. New York City, a lot of it is built by the Irish. You take a train, transcontinental, Irish. I mean, you go out to the West Coast, San Francisco, a lot of the Irish built it. The Irish put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in making America what it is today.
Shane, thank you so much for the insight, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.